From their trucks in front and in the rear, the ambulances with the seriously wounded going in between, they broke all through the general confusion, wildly firing at anyone trying to stop them. To get the transport out of the danger zone as soon as possible, their doctor steered them straight to the bridge across the river, which they managed to reach unharmed. A little later, they were safely in Haparanda on the Swedish side, complete with all their casualties, trucks and equipment. "What happened to Manhard's body? Did you see what became of him?" "No, we didn't," Herweg replied. "I'm sorry. To recover his body would have meant suicide. I'm certain the Finns gave him a decent burial. I said that we simply had to believe that, and wished Manhard had known that his mission was fulfilled." The Alta continued his account. He and his comrades were received very kindly and treated generously on the other side of the border. Swedish doctors took care of them, looking after the serious cases in an exemplary manner, and having them transferred to Norway by rail. The rest of the casualties were allowed to return to their units. They kept their weapons, were supplied with gasoline, and were accompanied by 2 Swedish doctors on their way to the north along the border. Somewhere at its lower course, they crossed the Muonio River and reached Kittila only a few days ago. More than an hour had passed. I had to return to my quarters. I said goodbye and good luck to the Alta. Herweg was seeing me out when he was approached by a medic, who said that he, Herweg, was to be on the next transport that was to leave in an hour's time. So there was little opportunity for a word I wanted to have with him alone. I just learned that he and the others on the raid returned from their mission at Tornio unhurt, and that he had been wounded somewhere between Tornio and Kemi some days later. The Finns, he said, had attacked Kemi with strong forces from the south, and at the same time from the islands off the coast. They didn't accomplish what the Russians had wanted them to do, which was to cut off and destroy the German combat group in that area. Again, the fighting had been ferocious and caused heavy losses on both sides. Kemi was said to lie in ruins. When I returned to my quarters, I found my comrades drinking cognac. They were having a great time. For once they had a roof over their heads, and tomorrow was another day of rest. I joined them eagerly, glad to be in their midst and feel their warmth. The cognac soothed my sadness, and let a painful notion slowly disappear that had begun to form in my mind. That this war, as probably all wars, was having its own way, paying no heed to high principles, aims and rules, and even less for those living by them. For this reason, the best would die first. Before I write about the events at Muonio, I must come back to Manhard once more. The subconscious is strange. It makes us do things for some hidden purpose, and, in the end, lets us discover things that are full of meaning. After I wrote about Manhard's death, I leafed through a tiny English book of biblical passages our chaplain, in his concern about my salvation, had given me some days before. I happened to come across the verse of John, "Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." These words struck me at first for their mere beauty, but then I realized it was an epitaph for Manhard. If there ever were to be a tomb for him, sometime somewhere on the shore of the Gulf of Bothnia, this verse would be a proper inscription. It would, I think, reveal the true meaning of his life and death. It might even sum up the short lives of all the other volunteers who stayed behind. 2 years earlier, by the end of October 1944, I was far from finding consolation in the words of the Bible. It was perhaps something pagan and romantic with which I tried to ease my grief over what I had heard from Herweg and the Alta. As we left Kittila behind, again, a wide triangular flight of geese, certainly the rear guard, rushed across the sky, shrill cries announcing their appearance, heading south without heed to borders and to war. Und fahren wir ohne Wiederkehr, rauscht uns im Herbst ein Amen. And were we to sail without return, in fall, your rush will be for us an Amen. 159 Rearguard and Breakthrough Operations Vic. Muonio, November 1944. The cryptic words of the song lingered in my mind and slowly clarified themselves as we marched on. Yes, I see, it's autumn again, and many of us were not to return from our tour to the north. Amen! The wings rushed and whispered, so be it. The men on the march said, Get on with your mission. Follow your call to duty just as we are following the call of nature. A few days later, we were back in combat. It began about 15 kilometers south of Muonio, where we had arrived after a 3-day forced march. The village is right at the Muonio River, which forms the border between Finland and Sweden. Here, the road from Rovaniemi-Kittilä meets the road from Tornio, which runs all along the border to the north, from the Gulf up to the Norwegian coast. In those days, this road was our last way out of Finland, and it was full of troops on their way north. For the Finns, the junction was the last opportunity for a major operation against the German forces on their territory. For both sides, the place was of great importance. At that time, however, I didn't have a clear picture of the general situation, which I have reconstructed only now with the help of a map. As a squad leader, I only knew that Muonio in our rear was not, for whatever reason, to be abandoned before the end of the month, and that the place must be held for the few remaining days. Orders were that SS Mountain Infantry Regiment 12 was to block the road from Kittilä against the east, while our regiment's task was to seal off the road from Tornio against the south. Throughout the day, we had seen the last units of the combat group coming up from Kemi-Tornio and passing through our line. Jaeger units, marked by the combat stress of the recent weeks, wearily marched on, and mountain artillery followed with their guns disassembled and carried by mules. Once in a while, even motorized vehicles passed, and then at last a Jaeger battalion of our own regiment, which we had relieved as rear guard. All of them would continue their march under cover of darkness toward Muonio and beyond. There were hundreds of kilometers to go. As we built up the defensive line and moved into positions on both sides of the road, our gun crew's mission was to secure the battalion's right flank. "Right limit of fire, the Swedish border," Schöpper had said, pointing to the blue line of the river on his map. To reach its bank, we only had to go about 1 kilometer through the forest. It was a reconnaissance patrol, though, for the Finns were thought capable of infiltrating along the sides of the road, even at this short distance. We stalked through the woods in a skirmishing line. The further we advanced, the more we became alarmed. The woods literally smelled of our opponents, who seemed to have been cooking somewhere ahead of us. Still, we arrived at the bank without enemy contact and found the hut we were looking for. We emplaced the gun there. Searching the hut, we saw that someone had been around only recently. There were remains of food and some warm ashes in the fireplace, but we didn't find any traces of troops. Outside, there was the river. A few meters down the embankment, it murmured over the water-worn stones on its way south, about 300 meters wide and probably not very deep. And then, as we looked over to the opposite bank, an idyllic, peaceful sight presented itself against a wooded background. A small settlement, red-painted cottages with white-lined gables and windows. A few people milled around after work, seemingly unaware of us. As night fell, lights went on and made the water sparkle. "Jesus Maria! It's unbelievable! I had almost forgotten there was anything like it," Stricker said, shaking his head in incredulity. Both of us remained on guard with the gun and listened sharply for any suspicious noises. Next to me, I saw the outlines of the gun and Stricker's profile, looking over his sight, sharply standing out against the lighter surface of the river. Again and again my eyes wandered over to the other side as the lights went out, one after another. I thought of Peter Paul and his family, and of our togetherness at my grandmother's house. The fighting started behind us. Suddenly, 1 kilometer behind our line, small arms fire broke out, submachine guns, hand grenades, short bursts from machine guns. At first, during a brief pause, we thought it was a false alarm, but then the shooting continued and grew more intense. So the Finns had managed to bypass us on this side of the road. Listening to the firing, we tried to imagine what the fight was like. It lasted for half an hour, the noise slowly shifting east and eventually dying out. We remained alert the rest of the night. At dawn, Bing took over the gun. Just as I was about to have a wink of sleep, he saw them and nudged me with his arm. There, in front of us, about 150 meters away where the river formed a bend, a line of soldiers came walking toward us. They were at least a platoon, with perhaps more of them behind, reinforcements for the unit operating in our rear. Obviously they didn't expect us here on the bank, or at least not yet. We lost no time in opening fire, both to keep them at a distance and to alarm the battalion. As our tracers whizzed down the bank, we saw the Finns, only shadows in my field glasses, ducking for cover and then reluctantly returning our fire. Our position was favourable. Under the cover of the hut, we had a good field of fire along the bank. We blasted away at anything we could see moving and kept them at bay. They withdrew. A reconnaissance party from the 12th Company went out, passed by our emplacement, and returned half an hour later to report that the Finns had vanished and that the bank was clear. Our skirmish had aroused the people on the Swedish side from their sleep. They had gathered on the bank, some white-helmeted soldiers with field glasses among them. Full of curiosity, they watched a spectacle that they probably wouldn't see again in a lifetime. The children were chased back to the houses by their mothers. With the enemy behind us, anything could happen now. Our situation could well turn into a matter of life and death, as it had down at Tornio. With the peaceful land so close by and the people looking on, though, our firefight had a distinctly histrionic touch. I was struck by the thought that since there was this audience, we shouldn't disappoint them if worse came to worst. Actually, the situation had deteriorated. From the messenger, we learned that the Finns had ambushed our battalion's trains, in which our supplies and wounded were carried. Several men and animals had been killed, more were wounded, and a Finnish battalion held a wide stretch of the road between us and Muonio. As if that wasn't enough, a strong Finnish patrol operating in the rear had come upon our regimental command post during the night. In the ensuing short fight, our regimental commander had been killed by a submachine gun. Further in the distance, we could hear the rolling thunder of artillery from the northeast, the direction where we knew our sister regiment was engaged. So it was in a mood of unpleasant and rising uncertainty that we stayed in our position on the bank of the Muoniojoki. Meanwhile, the Swedes on the other side were going about their daily business. Later that day, we returned to the roadside. Events then began to take place in quick succession. Heinrich was there with his gun squad. Immediately, our 2 machine guns were ordered up the road, northward, to support the 13th Company. Where the road began to bend, we were to report to their company command post. The Finns, they said, had blocked the road right behind. As we were hurrying, we saw that the area on both sides of the road was packed with men from the rifle companies, alert for an assault. We passed mortar emplacements and, with rising spirits, spotted the 2 Siam quadruple flak half-track under camouflage at the edge of the wood. Stricker groaned under the weight of the MG mount on his back, but we hurried on. We were right near the bend when suddenly, in front, the fireworks erupted. Infantry small arms started first. Then Finnish mortars joined in, scattering their shells over the area. In no time we were in the midst of a deafening battle. A motorcyclist dashed up from behind, passed by at reckless speed, and made for the bend ahead. Only then did we realize that the battalion commander had been kneeling in the sidecar, about to take control over a clash that had gone off prematurely. It was a sight all of us needed in these minutes before our attack. "Ein Mordskirl," Bing said admiringly, looking after him as he sped down the road without regard for the mortar shells. We were still looking for the 13th CP when the battalion commander came rushing back, his motorbike skidding to a halt right beside us, the sidecar sharply swerving about. "Get your guns into position right over there," he yelled to us, rising in his sidecar and pointing to the ditches on both sides of the road. "And give the quadruple flak cover as soon as she's backed up here." We hurried over to the bend. No sooner had we mounted our gun in the ditch than the flak wagon came backing up. It moved into position right in the middle of the road. Clearly visible and elevated, it was now utterly exposed to the Finnish MGs, except for the armoured shield in front of the crew. In an instant, the wagon was in a hail of tracer bullets. Now we recognized the Finnish positions from their muzzle flashes and the tracers, and immediately started hammering away with our gun to keep them down. At the same time, the quadruple cannon burst into life, pouring a gush of 2-centimetre shells directly into the Finnish positions. The gunner, seated in a chair that is part of the gun carriage, easily swiveled the gun at different targets, banging away in short, devastating bursts. In front, we saw the first men of the assault group jumping up and running ahead, keeping close to the edge of the wood, firing from the hip. The battalioner turned up again, racing his motorbike down the road where the men were lying alert on both sides. I heard him yelling, "Boys, we're in for it! Come on now, let's give them hell!" And then, in a single great thrust, the battalion broke through, the riflemen storming ahead and sweeping away all resistance they met on a stretch of more than a kilometre. We dismounted our gun from the mount, left our ditch, and ran forward with the others. We then moved laterally in support of the parties pursuing the Finns into the forest, firing at random and thus securing the way behind us for the mass of the battalion that was pushing out of its trap. The Finns had withdrawn into the forest and up the hills to the east, while those on our side, the western side, made it to the river on the Swedish side to get out of danger. When we came to the riverbank, we saw the rest of them swimming and wading through the water. Who could blame them at this stage of the war? We let them go. On our way toward Muonio, we passed the spot where our trains had been ambushed that morning. It was a mess. Wrecked vehicles and dead mules were still lying about on the side of the road. Our wounded had been rescued, and our dead had been laid on carts to be taken with us for a decent burial. Daredevil! Muonio. We reached Muonio by night. We couldn't stay there. Finnish artillery had followed up and was shelling the village. We bivouacked outside near the river, passing by our steaming field kitchens, which were waiting for us and preparing to hand out hot pea soup with bacon fat. What a feast! The next morning we were again assigned as the rear guard and moved into a position before the first houses of the village. We were to hold the line until dark. Heinrich came over for a palaver. He met the messenger and had more news. SS Mountain Infantry Regiment 12 had had a very similar experience. First, an attack on the regimental command post, and then their rearguard battalion was encircled. They too had shot their way out of it, but their death toll on that road was high. Before Heinrich left, he said, "Come on, I'll show you something. You simply must have a look." His gun was emplaced by the road next to the village. "Here, look," he said, pointing to the post. What I saw were several Finnish medals nailed to the sign, while right above the word Muonio, the words Das war. That were crudely painted in black letters. Seeing my puzzled face, he explained. It was the battalioner who had nailed up his Finnish decorations first, his officers following his example. When he had reached the spot where the Finns had ambushed our trains, he saw the wounded being rescued and the corpses of the dead mule skinners. Most of the latter had been killed with their rifles still slung across their backs, so taken were they by surprise. The scene had driven him berserk, and now he was thinking of revenge. But what really could he do except destroy the place that was to be set on fire anyway? It ended up with a ceremonial act of revenge, grimly carried out, to soothe the mind of the officer who was deeply hurt by what he had seen and frustrated about his failure to protect his less seasoned soldiers. At dusk, we departed. Passing through the village, we saw engineers preparing their work of destruction on what was left from the shelling. Now that the Finns had become our enemies, retreat meant also depriving them of all facilities that could serve them as a base for further actions against the rear guard. After we left the village, we didn't walk the road but slipped onto a trail leading through the wood and up the hills that rose east of the road. Rumour had it that Finnish forces of unknown strength were lying in ambush again, somewhere near the road north of us. On our way through the wood, we heard the detonations down in the village. After more climbing, our trail levelled out, and we took a break. Standing on a spot high above Muonio, we had a view of the village, which was on fire. When the flames, for a full, first-hand account of 3 days' battalion, SS Mountain Infantry Regiment 12's battle at Muonio, see Wolf Zoepf's 7 Days in January, 48-51. Would eventually go out, only the church and the town sign would be left of the village on the river. Today, as a prisoner of war, as I recall the scene, I believe that most of us were sad about what happened, and sad about the broken word of our former brothers in arms. There was our high regard for Finland and its people, but there also was that breach of loyalty. We rated loyalty very high among the human virtues. It was embossed on our belt buckles, meine Ehre heißt Treue, or my honour is my loyalty. We also saw, however, that the Finns were caught in a conflict of loyalties. To refuse the conditions of the armistice and to stand by the Germans in loyalty at that stage of the war would have resulted in Finland's destruction as a nation, which in turn would have meant disloyalty to their country. We were untroubled by any such conflict. The unconditional surrender formula left us without an alternative. Moreover, at that time, we didn't know what we know now of the character and extent of the Jewish persecution. Had we known, our loyalty to the Führer would likewise have been a gross disloyalty to our country, as it was in fact for the many involved in those dark schemes. But then, early in November 1944, there was no time for musing. What mattered was evading the next encirclement. We resumed our march to the north. A sudden gust of wind swept over us. It was damp and very cold, and it smelled of snow. We were fast asleep, Stricker and I, and Heinrich was lying in the middle. When Heinrich stirred and turned over from his right side to his left, it was the signal for us to turn over as well, a ritual carried out several times during this night and many nights before. Despite the extreme cold outside, we felt fairly warm, closely huddled together under 3 layers of blankets. Each of us had his anorak underneath, its fur lining turned inside out and spread out on a layer of brushwood we had gathered and loaded onto our carts together with a supply of firewood before we left the woodland zone. Our boots were in the middle of the tent around a little stove, which was kept going overnight by the guard. I had no idea what time it was. It couldn't be long before reveille. I only knew there would be no dawn, at least not before noon. The season for daylight was over, up here in the mountainous north of Lapland in the middle of November. Today the light would creep up the horizon only a little earlier, now that it had stopped snowing and the wind had turned. I was awake by now. Cautiously I rose from our lair, put on my boots, slipped into my anorak, and went outside. The cold hit me in the face and instantly caused the mucus in my nose to freeze. The wind from the northeast swept the cold over the land and cleared the sky of snow clouds. Now that the huge sky was spangled with stars of extreme brilliance, it seemed that the cold of the universe was extending its stern rule down to this place on the globe. Our tents, some 20 of them for 16 men each, were covered with white frost. From the field kitchen came the clanking of utensils, a sound immediately swallowed by the snow. A man was building a fire to make coffee. I went over to him, curious about the temperature. "It's 36 degrees below 0 Celsius, he said. If he was right, this was the absolute record we had experienced to date. Farther back, I saw a head-high mass that somehow struck me as being alive. I suddenly became aware it was our mules who had been standing there all night under their white frozen blankets, tightly huddled together in a concise circle, heads in the middle and backs exposed to the cold, motionless, not a flicker of their ears betraying that they were alive, patiently holding out in the cold darkness with endless endurance. I felt warm affection for them. Without them, we would be lost up here. They were right in calling our pack animals Comrade Mule. At the edge of our little camp, the dim figures of the guards could be made out against the snow-covered ground, sentinels not so much against our pursuers, but against the hostile wilderness. It had been nearly 2 weeks since we had lost contact with the Finns. In this treeless, empty vastness, they had no chance against us, and they seemed to have given up. Now the Arctic winter had become the enemy both of us had to fight. It was something of a wonder that warm human bodies could be sound asleep under the thin canvas of our tents. That night we finished packing up all our things and loaded them onto our carts and the mules. We departed in good spirits. Ahead of us was the last stretch of our march out of Finland, some 30 kilometres. We were scheduled to pass through a new fortified position after 3/4 of that distance, a barrier said to belong to the future front line of the German army in Norway. We knew we were the last battalion on this route along the Swedish border. The mass of the division was already far ahead, perhaps, as we liked to think, already on the high seas sailing home. Only a few more days, and we too would reach the coast where we hoped a ship would be waiting for us. The magic word was Skibotten, a little town and seaport at the Lingen fjord where the road ended. Yet before this night was over, some greater magic was in store for us. At first it was only an occasional flicker across the sky. But then, as we were marching on and the hours passed by, it became a yellowish light that, while growing stronger and stronger, was set in erratic motion and became more and more mixed with waves and cascades of blue and green and red. Again and again we glanced up to the sky where this dramatic spectacle was being staged overhead. It lasted for a long time. Then our column came to a halt and we had a rest. There was tea from the field kitchen and Zwieback, biscuit rusk. As we stood around the kitchen wagon sipping our tea and smoking cigarettes, we saw the lights slowly fading away, unveiling the Milky Way, Orion, the Great Bear, the brilliant cluster of the Pleiades, and all the other constellations in the dome above. Baumer took out his harmonica and played an old folk song that everybody knew. At first we only hummed the melody, but then we sang all the verses. In that moment our thoughts were back home. Simultaneously we were saying farewell to a country many of us had grown to love and had defended as if it were our own, a land where we left our dead and where perhaps pieces of our hearts remained. As usual, a grimmer reality soon caught up with us. We were marching along the road the way we used to, in small groups trotting in single file, our mountain caps drawn deep onto our faces, which were further protected against the icy wind by woolen scarves. In between trotted our mules, carrying our heavier equipment and supplies on their backs or drawn in carts. The snow on the road had been trampled in recent days by the hundreds of boots, hooves and wheels of the units that had already passed through, leaving the snow sometimes crumbled and sometimes hard and icy, depending on the exposure of the respective stretches to the wind. As it happened, we were in sight of the field kitchen, drawn by 2 mules ahead of us. The road went into an open bend, traversing a slope that rose moderately to the right and dropped steeply to the left, ending in the river. Here the road surface had turned into pure ice and inclined to the left due to the snowdrifts. The 2 kitchen wagon mules hesitated to go further around the bend, but the driver, either out of negligence or certainly at the risk of his life, drove them along. Then we saw it happen. The iron-rimmed wheels began to slip on the ice, first the rear wheels, then the whole heavy metal body moved to the left, tearing man, mule and cart down the slope with increasing speed, overturning and crashing onto the ice of the river, splintering and shattering to pieces. Arriving at the edge of the river, we found the driver dead under the cauldron. The mules had to be shot. We rescued what was left of the rations, and the rest was abandoned. We had to move on. Nonetheless, we reached the new front line, which reclined against steep mountain walls, 1 hour ahead of schedule. We had seen the towering white range slowly emerging from the darkness as we approached from the foothills. The battalion halted across a wide expanse. Nobody seemed to know why. In the grim cold, we kept moving around in place, wondering again and again why the battalion didn't go on. After a while, word got out that the army guards were under orders not to let us pass before 12 o'clock sharp. What should have been a jubilant moment resulted in an encounter with military bureaucracy that didn't care about the last battalion spending another hour waiting out there in the cold. Hadn't our battalioner driven ahead? Had he been with us, he would have forced his way through. Thus ended our battalion's engagement in Finland. What then began was the long march we finished 2.5 months later, adding some 700 kilometres to the nearly 900 kilometres that we had walked from our positions at Seno Zero. From now on, we would be marching 30 to 40 kilometres each night in darkness, with only a few days of rest in between, a route paved with hardships, hunger, mental and physical exhaustion, disappointments, and sometimes despair. How did we make it? I really don't know. Of course, our youth was responsible for winning half the battle, and the awareness of being on our way home contributed to our endurance as well. In the end, I think it was our spirit, that sense of duty that allowed no weakness, and our conviction that we were doing the right thing. Only fragments of that march have survived in my memory. It began with our realization that there was no ship waiting for us when we came down the Skibotn Valley and reached the Lingen Fjord. Without delay, we were dispatched to march on and filtered into the stream of troops coming from the Murmansk front, the northern sector of the Lapland army, which now was flowing back on Reichsstrasse 50, the road built during the war that, more or less, lined the northern Norwegian coast. We were to cover every single kilometre of this road from Skibotn in the north to Mo i Rana, the terminus of the railway from the south. If it hadn't been winter at that time, otherwise magnificent scenery would have been our constant companion. It wasn't the season for sightseeing or for discovering Hamsun's town of Segelvoss. It was the time when, in that region, the long night was about to begin, the night that would last for 1 or 2 months, depending on the latitude. We learned, however, to distinguish between different shades of darkness, and it was usually in the twilight at noon that we got some faint idea of the place we had reached. Sometimes it would be a village we would see, a few red-painted houses by the sea, now and then some villagers, fishermen, their hands deep in their pockets, seemingly dawdling away their time and showing no interest in us intruders. Occasionally one would come out of his house, grab some fish he had dropped days or weeks earlier on the snow nearby, and disappear behind the door. Sometimes in the evening, when we started another of our daily 30-kilometre marches and were passing by the last houses of some modest settlement, we would catch a glimpse of a family sitting behind blue-checkered curtains around their table for some modest meal, a picture we had almost forgotten and which seemed to us like paradise. When we marched along the shore of a fjord and the weather was clear, and a navy vessel would glide out of the harbour, we would indulge in imaginative thoughts about life on a warship, cabins under deck that were brightly lit with warm and cosy bunks, and sailors who were clean and tidy after their daily showers. Then we would long for the town of Narvik, which we believed to be the final destination of our march, and where we were sure we would embark on a ship bound for home. Most of the time, however, there was fog, snow, and frost in addition to the darkness. The road didn't always skirt along the coast either. I think it was between Balsfjord and Narvik that we traversed a mountain range for 3 days. The weather was bad, and when we started on our second day, it got worse. We had entered the long valley the day before. Our destination for that night was a camp on the pass. It was snowing from the outset, and within an hour or two we were in the middle of a blizzard. The road wound uphill and would have been a strain even in fine weather, but now we had to make it against the white squalls, where it was hard even to see the men in front of you. The mules, though, were a solace and relief, relentlessly pulling through the flurry, trotting uphill with their heads eagerly nodding with every pace, while we would, from time to time, grab their manes for guidance and support, which they didn't mind. As the hours of that night went by, our stops became more frequent as more and more snowdrifts kept blocking the road and had to be removed with shovels. Once we had to stop to wait for a group in the rear to close up. Casualties had to be looked after and needed transportation. Meanwhile, more and more squalls swept over the battalion as it struggled uphill. The road couldn't be seen anymore. The only things we could use to orient ourselves were tall poles standing by the road and marking the route towards the pass. It was even difficult for the men in front to make out the next pole once they had reached the last. Eventually we became stuck in a huge bank of snow that required hours to remove by hand. It was clear to everyone by now that we were in a dangerous situation. We tried to keep warm as well as we could, waiting for orders to make camp or whatever. We were lucky, though. In all that turmoil, we heard the muffled noise of a heavy motor vehicle ahead of us. The army post at the pass had sent out a bulldozer to meet us. Before long, the road was cleared, and the battalion passed through, while the drivers in the cabs of their huge vehicles mildly responded to our grateful waves. The station on the pass was desolate. If we had thought there would be a warm reception with steaming field kitchens, a hearty meal, and warm accommodations, we would have been utterly disappointed. What we got were straw mattresses on the cold floors of metal Nissen huts. The inner walls were thickly coated with ice. There was no opportunity to dry our clothes. The food service was negligible. We lay down cold and hungry, but were lucky to have been rescued from the trap in the valley, safe from the snow and the wind howling around the hut. After we had passed Narvik, again there was no ship in sight to take us home. The long Jaeger columns walked the endless road as if in a trance, night after night enveloped in constant darkness, ice and snow, many of them more or less asleep, keeping track only by holding on to the mane of a mule. Some of the more unfortunate would miss a road bend and wake up in a ditch. Heinrich, for instance, was a master of the art of sleeping on the march, and more than once my somnambulist companion was guided around an obstacle by a mule or by one of us. On these nights of general numbness, nothing mattered but the one daily object, conquering the next distance lying ahead of us. Even physical pain, blisters for instance, which on departure had seemed to make further walking impossible, went unnoticed after 10 kilometres. Rations were always insufficient. Our main course at noon was mostly drachtverhau, soup. What could we expect, though, being mere transit guests with different army units every different day? Somewhere between Narvik and Mo, we had a day of rest. Stricker and I lingered about the village, where we were allured by the sweet scent of freshly baked bread from an army bakery. Absolutely fascinated, we watched hundreds of fresh loaves loaded onto a truck closely backed up to the building. After peering into the gap of the door and conquering his pride, Stricker approached the beefy staff sergeant in charge. "Need some help?" "All right, you paupers, get yourself in the line over there," he said with grumpy condescendence. Squeezing ourselves through the gap and surrounded by all those loaves of bread, we felt as though we were in Schlaraffenland. Loading the truck was easy work. Half an hour later, we walked away with one whole loaf each. First, we just wanted to sample it, to cut off a slice with our pukos, then another one, and then, as it is with paupers, we didn't know how to stop and devoured the 2 loaves on the spot. On me, the feast had adverse effects. We moved on the same night. There was severe frost. After some hours of walking, I began to feel queasy and bowel-weary. Since we formed the rear, I fell behind when I had to relieve myself. I barely managed to close up when I had to relieve myself further. The distance to the rear of my march unit grew greater and greater. The night was clear, and there was no risk of getting lost. Shivering and dizzy, I eventually became too weak to catch up with our group, and found myself quite alone in that forlorn stretch of land. I suddenly realized that if I didn't move on, I would probably die. So, more or less subconsciously, I walked on, tottering and shivering and constantly bullying myself. "Come on, you arschloch, get moving, and for God's sake don't stop!" In the end, I reached our camp with my last ounce of strength, literally on all fours. "Where have you been? You look ghastly," Stricker said when I had found our tent and dropped on the straw. Aside from our exhaustion, it was the general war situation that made this Arctic winter even darker. The disappointment we felt when it turned out there would be no embarkation at Narvik was soon surpassed by the bad news from the fronts on the continent, by the arriving letters about the seemingly indiscriminate and unchecked bombing of our cities, and by the general scarcity of supplies. Heinrich's comments became gloomier. "You see, it's obvious. Shipping troops down the Norwegian coast is no longer possible. Insufficient tonnage, insufficient protection. That's why we have to make it on foot. And look at our stupid running every silly kilometre around the fjords. They don't even have a little ferry to bring us across. So we slouch on, only to find ourselves within reach of the place across the water where we started 2 days ago. Now, come on, Heinrich, I would say. It's not that bad. First, we're mountain infantry, not the navy. It's our job to march. It's nearly a wonder we've come so far. Remember the day we started from Kusamo? Remember your own forebodings? I think we're quite a success." "What do you mean, success? It's a retreat, a full-blown retreat. That's what we've accomplished. It's the same wherever you look. Look at the overall situation. Can you see anything else but retreat? You must be hallucinating," he said angrily. "There's nothing so bad as to be without merit," I replied. "At least our front lines will be getting much shorter. That will improve our combat power. The more our fronts close in, the better." "Brilliant! Now I see. Once we are back on the continent, things will take a turn for the better. What do you think the Lapland army can do in the circumstances? Jaeger against panzers? It's like going for a machine gun with a crossbow." "Ever heard of Panzerjoust? It's said to be a very efficient weapon for the infantry, mountain infantry included. Anyhow, cheer up. Let our leaders do the worrying. In a month's time, things may look much brighter." This discussion was in consonance with the pattern of many a talk we had together. Actually, I didn't see things much differently, and I felt drawn to this austere, unromantic character with the long, sombre face. As our trek dragged on, all of us went through a process of mental attrition. I believe it was in that December of that year that I, too, lost my illusions about the outcome of the war. Still, our proud battalion hadn't become a gaggle of demoralized wretches. Sometimes on our march we would even sing, though it was out of defiance rather than for the fun of it. One night we finally made it across the Arctic Circle, this time heading south. Clear weather and the moon had set the stage for the occasion. We were in the mountains again. On both sides of the road, white peaks of the fields formed the horizon. While the first groups were passing the signpost indicating the Arctic Circle, someone in front started singing "Jetzt kommen die lustigen Tage, Schatzel ade ade, und dass ich es dir auch gleich sage, es tut ja gar nicht weh. Denn im Sommer da blut der rote Mohn, und ein lustiges Blut kommt überall davon. Schatzel ode, ode, Schatzel ode." The song has 3 verses, but it was the first one, with the merry days to come, that was repeated as often as it took the long line of the battalion to march past the sign. When our squad approached it, we recognized the battalioner standing by the post, somewhat remote, not, as we used to know him, leaning on his stick, but very erect this time, his knight's cross gleaming, now and then lifting his hand for a salute. Coming closer, I saw he had tears in his eyes. It may have been the cold wind that was blowing through the valley. 2 days later we reached Meaux. Now then, begin the merry days. Sweetheart, farewell, farewell. And let me tell you right away, I shan't be feeling pain. For red, red poppies in summer bloom, and a merry blood comes of it soon. Sweetheart, farewell, farewell, sweetheart, farewell. My bunk in the hold of the troopship was the lowest of 4. The space up to the next was so narrow I had to squeeze myself in to lie down. All of the bunks, rows of them, were occupied mostly by men of our battalion. Somewhere, a ventilation fan was noisily at work, competing with the chugging engine that kept everything vibrating. We were 3 decks down on the passage from Oslo to Denmark. It was Christmas Eve, 1944. I was chewing on an extra portion of dry bread, a gift from Heinrich, who was lying in the bunk across the aisle. Handing it over, he managed a forced smile, murmured some felicitations, and then turned away, closing his eyes. He was seasick. His emaciated face had a greenish tint that made me think of him on his deathbed. It had been 4 days since the train departed from Meaux to bring us down south. We were the last battalion of the division to be transported. We had been in Oslo for 1 day. From the train, we went directly to the delousing station and the shower baths. There we received new underwear, haircuts, a fairly decent meal, and then we were off to the docks for embarkation. By then, the brief hours of daylight had been over. Of the city, we had seen only the blackout. In the baths, we heard that the bulk of our division had passed through 2 weeks before. They probably were already on leave, just in time for Christmas. We needed some luck if we were to spend the holiday in Denmark. We also learned that the Norwegian volunteers had gone home for good. There had been a military ceremony for their formal discharge. Their engagement had been restricted from the outset to the front in Finland. For Finland and the honour of Norway was their maxim. Their mission was fulfilled. Good luck to them. They were great comrades and deserved the ceremony. While we were putting on our things, those of us thinking about what we had heard realized how unlimited our own commitment had been in comparison to the Norwegians. There were some sarcastic remarks. "Yeah, the delousing station. Isn't that something? There's a ceremony for you. How could we expect anything else? My own feelings were confused. There certainly was some envy of our Norwegian comrades involved, but then hadn't we had a ceremony of our own on that night at the Arctic Circle the week before which suited us better than anything? That Karelian chapter, though, was closed. Our thoughts were not about Christmas that night aboard the ship. Our main concern was to make it safely to Denmark, for which there was no guarantee at all. If that giant sardine box of a ship were hit by a torpedo, we saw no chance of getting out on deck. To think of the panic! By the way, why were the sailors with the submachine guns posted up there around the hatches and the stairs? The black figures with their turned-up collars and watch caps that we had seen when we boarded the ship looked rather sinister. The next morning the weather was clear and frosty. The day promised to be fine. Happy about our safe arrival and full of anticipation, we watched our equipment being unloaded on the docks of the Danish seaport. Even the ship had a friendly look, lying there in the morning sun, as if she wanted to say, "See, I made it!" It was fun watching our mules, one after another, hanging down from a derrick, their legs sticking out from a wide-meshed net, being swung over the bulwark and nimbly eased down on the wharf. We then had to sort out our equipment, saddle the mules, and load them with our guns and ammunition, fasten the cinches, and prepare for departure. This activity took us almost until noon. Then began our march through the town to the barracks. We walked in single file, some 25 squads of Jaeger, pack animals, carts, wagons, field kitchens, ambulances, and so on, but no motor vehicles. It was all performed at a route step. Only the resultant irregular clatter of mountain boots and hooves sounded on the pavement. Soon we were passing a church. The bells were chiming, and churchgoers were coming out, parents with their children, young blonde girls, boys with ties, elderly people, ladies proudly in furs, gentlemen in black, fur-lined overcoats and bowlers. The long line of emaciated young veterans in worn-out combat gear, walking through their town, openly carrying their light and heavy weapons, led by their highly decorated commander on horseback, and looking in awe from under the peaks of their battered mountain caps at the people's immaculate appearance, and the tidy, peaceful surroundings must have been an awkward sight on a Christmas morning. The contrast between us seemed to have an offensive effect on the Danes, for they averted their eyes, just as we, becoming aware of their reaction, avoided looking at them in return. So we walked on with our eyes straight ahead, trying to look indifferent to the unfamiliar surroundings. I think on that extraordinary march, many of us recalled the battalion's combat actions of the past, and were trying to maintain the pride we needed so badly in these surroundings, and that we felt was so justified. Hadn't we also fought together with other European volunteers for Europe's freedom to celebrate Christmas? Wasn't that feast long since swept from the Soviet territories? And wasn't it likely to be swept from the rest of the continent if the Bolsheviks succeeded in carrying their revolution into Germany, as they had tried before, and as the Comintern hadn't stopped proclaiming ever since? We also came through a residential area where I caught sight of a maid in a black dress and white apron taking the family dog for a walk. How long ago had it been that I had belonged to that world? In our still untarnished thinking at that time, we were involved in a secular clash of two irreconcilable worlds. I thought this town, as it appeared to us on that morning, was a fine example of the civilized world we were defending. Yet, at the same time, it occurred to me that in the process of that struggle, aside from the sacrifices of the dead, we ourselves had become savages. Right after Christmas, we went over to the Isle of Finn for some rest. To us, it was a veritable Garden of Eden. Under the clear sky, a lovely, even countryside under a thin cover of snow stretched as far as the eye could see, adorned by snug, red-tiled farmhouses, white fences, and occasionally a small village with a church steeple. We had all the freedom we wanted to roam the neighbourhood, as long as we went in pairs and kept our weapons with us. Stricker was my companion in these days. We had discovered a farm where, on the first day, we were given cow-warm milk and thickly buttered slices of bread, for which the farmer declined our offer to pay. There were two girls, both very fair, one buxom and lively, the other skinny, meek, and endowed with large and gentle blue eyes. Her name was Anya. Stricker, coming from a farm, eagerly offered to help with the work in the stables, quite obviously to be with the buxom girl. We spent 3 days there, arriving in the morning as soon as we were free and leaving in the evening. When we left on the 3rd day, Anya and I kissed in the back of the barn. Not much of a kiss, rather a shy one, perhaps something to build on the next day, which was New Year's Eve. That was the end of it, though, as on that day we were confined to our quarters while new equipment was issued, including the new MG42 in exchange for our good old MG34, and preparations were made for our departure. It wasn't girls I was after during that time. I was anxious only to divert myself from a deep sadness that had been lurking in the back of my mind since we had come to that island. The mail, which we had not seen since arriving in Narvik, had been awaiting us upon our arrival. There were 2 letters for me. One was from Christina, who wrote about her work as a nurse in a hospital at Hanover. It was a brave letter, but the little she wrote about the air raids left me wondering whether we weren't better off in combat than our nurses were in the cities. The second letter was from my mother, a heartwarming letter in her elaborate, lively style. At the end, she wrote that Philip had been killed in action 2 months ago. His parents had been informed that he fell during his division's breakout from the encirclement at Cherkassy. The news came as a blow to me. Deep inside, I felt that Manhard and Philip had been my 2 paragons of our post-war elite and our post-war leadership. Now that they were gone, I could no longer conjure an image of a future to look forward to. It is perhaps only now, in recalling these days, that I realize the full meaning of this loss. It best explains, however, the void I felt and the sadness that ensued. On New Year's Eve, I wanted to forget it all and became slightly drunk with Stricker and Heinrich. I remember us singing more and more loudly, and that at midnight Bing fired a whole box of tracer ammunition in the air with the new MG42 he had mounted in an anti-aircraft position. We switched off the radio when we heard some party big shot speechifying. We wanted none of that. The next day we sailed for the mainland, and on the 2nd of January we left by train for our next mission, Operation Nordwind. The train rumbled very slowly over the bridge across the Rhine on its approach to the main station in Cologne. Despite the cold outside, Schmidtchen, our sunny comrade from that city, had opened the door of the wagon a bit to catch a glimpse of the river. In the moonless night and total blackout, however, no lights along the riverbanks were visible, and no sparkling reflection on the water marked its course. We were staring into complete darkness. I didn't care. The river had never stirred the patriotic feelings in me that it did in others, nor could I understand its much-celebrated romance. My first impression from a rail trip along the river years before had been a scenery of hills that, in the monotony of their endless vineyards, seemed deprived of their natural beauty. There was another crossing of the Rhine that came back to my mind. December 1939, the war being in a lull. Our family was on the way to see my father over Christmas at his station near the Belgian border. This was the same setting, the same thick air of foreboding. In these first days of 1945, on the way to the Western Front, though, it was the river's historical significance that prevailed in my mind. The river had been a symbol of Germany's assertion of her western territory from the days of ancient Rome to the Napoleonic Wars, and even to the present. Now the front was getting closer, and the battle for the Reich had begun. "Germany's river of fate," I said to Heinrich. "It prefers to stay in hiding, just the way we are kept in the dark about our next mission." "Well, at least we know by now that it'll be the Western Front and not the East," Heinrich said. "That's right, and aren't we lucky? I hated the idea of being back in the East. Still, where are we going?" "Whatever, to me it's all the same. The East or the West, what difference does it make anyway?" Heinrich said ruefully. "We won't hold them up." The train had now come to a halt in the main station. With the door still slightly open, we could see people hurrying about, if only in the short moments of their crossing one of the dim circles thrown on the ground from the darkened lamps above. "Listening to you," I said, "one could think of throwing away our arms just as well. Don't you think that with one more great effort, Maybe this front can be stabilized or even pushed back? Wouldn't things look quite different then? Yeah, sure, just the way we stopped them on their way down from Normandy. My dear Johann, if you had taken some time to read a paper instead of ogling that Danish girl, you'd know better. This great effort of yours took place only a month ago in the Ardennes. It didn't get us far. Sure, I know, but the Ardennes is woodland, ill-suited for a panzer army, and there's more woodland down south. Now, if all the mountain divisions coming from the north were employed in the woods, thrown into another real big thrust, it could work, don't you think so? I envy your optimism, Heinrich said, ending our talk. The train moved on and was now slowly going through the city of Cologne. Schmidtchen stood at the door. We heard him groan in his funny Cologne dialect. Oh my God! Look! See that? I didn't know it was as bad as that. I went to the door and looked out. I remembered towering rear walls of the business and housing districts on both sides of the thoroughfare, but there was total emptiness now. Sometimes a ragged structure glared out from the dark flat expanse. The city of Cologne was gone. Even in the dark we could see that much. Schmidtchen was shocked beyond words at what he saw. We stood there, not knowing what to say. As the train slowly took up speed, Schmidtchen jerked the door shut. Some days later we were back in combat again. Our area of operations was the low Vosges. We stood in a small circle, the men of my gun and Heinrich with a few of his men. We were freezing, our hands shoved deeply into the pockets of our anoraks, caps and shoulders under the hoods of our canvas sheets for protection from the sleet that swept through the forest. As always, we had dug in, but it was too cold to remain in our foxholes. We shifted and stomped our feet to keep warm. Other groups stood around, scattered over the area, the woods full of them. All 3 Jaeger battalions of our regiment were assembled, waiting for the attack to begin early the next morning. Our objective was to retake the hills that had been lost by some infantry division only one day after they had moved into the positions we had held before, 2 hills near the village of Reipertsweiler. The hours in the assembly area before an attack are among the most miserable moments in a soldier's life. The thought of one's own death cannot be chased away, nor can the nagging certainty that one's own luck cannot be permanent. This waiting, I think, is the most sombre experience of being up front in a war that seems endless. Sooner or later it is bound to be my turn. Death is no shared or communal experience. It is utterly individual. In those moments, one is quite alone in the middle of his comrades. No one talked. Our faces were concealed in the dark. Only now and then a face under the peak of a mountain cap would light up from the red glow of a cigarette. American artillery had already claimed casualties in our ranks during the days before. In the afternoon, heavy artillery fire fell on our assembly area. It seemed as if our new enemy's resources in barrels and ammunition were without limit. From the day we disembarked from the train, the Americans kept hammering our supply and approach routes without surcease. On our march up to the front, we had seen the results: dead horses, destroyed carts, and a dead mule skinner spread-eagled in the middle of the road. Again and again we sought shelter from bursting shells. We observed a gruesome sight when we walked a forest trail and passed a bunker. A Red Cross flag sticking out and a heap of dead bodies next to it, piled up like firewood. We'd get to know the special way of the Americans with their artillery even more cruelly during the months to come. The Americans would not send their infantry forward until they had done their absolute utmost to destroy their enemies with awesome displays of artillery firepower, which often lasted for hours. This was a luxury which we, unfortunately, could not even hope for at this stage of the war. Our SS Mountain Infantry Regiment 12 had been part of Operation Nordwind from its start on New Year's Eve. When we reached the area, the rumour was that the regiment had suffered heavy casualties in their first action at Vingen. There were wild stories of the regiment breaking through the American lines, of a great number of prisoners taken, and of a deep penetration into Alsace. Good news, good for our morale. The bad news, however, was that only a few days later they had had to withdraw because somehow the units on both flanks had lagged behind. Our sister regiment had lost too many dead, missing and wounded. One of them had his testicles shot off, they said. It was hard to shake off all that misery as we gathered on that night in the assembly area for our first encounter with the armies, as we referred to the Americans. I had seen our new opponents only through my binoculars. On our first day in the line, we repelled a probe they had started, inflicting casualties on them. Their action hadn't ended yet when they sent their medics and an ambulance right onto the battlefield to rescue their wounded. I couldn't believe my eyes. What kind of a war was this? Nothing like that would have happened on the Eastern Front, but here some of the rules of war seemed still to be in force, valid for both sides. In the background, I saw their officers racing around in their compact little cars, as if we were on manoeuvres. This first encounter seemed to support our general feeling that these armies couldn't be regarded as mortal enemies. Yet our first real clash with them was to result in one of the great ordeals we were destined to go through. "God damn!" Heinrich suddenly burst out. "Why are we standing around here the whole goddamned night doing nothing, getting soaked and stiff in the knees? Come on, let's put up a tent, keep the wet out, and try to get some sleep." Bing and Stricker went for some brushwood to lie on, while Heinrich and I buttoned 4 triangular canvas sheets together. Others didn't bother that much and just pitched a square sheet for 2. A little later, the 4 of us lay down in our tent, huddling together. The comfort we gained from it was imaginary rather than real. Shivering all over, I felt the sleet trickling down from the canvas upon the moss right beside my head. I must have slept for quite a while because it was only at dawn that I noticed the sleet had turned to snow. Outside the woods, the white-covered terrain shimmered through the tree trunks. We removed the tent, took up our gear, and put on our white-covered helmets, ready to go. We then hung around for hours. For some reason, the attack was postponed until noon. When our artillery preparatory fire began, we rushed out and swept in a skirmishing line down the slope that lay between us and the hills beyond. The resistance was feeble. The few advanced posts were soon eliminated or overrun. The army's main force was on the wooded slopes of the hills. As soon as we arrived at the foot of one hill, the American mortars and howitzers began firing. The rifle companies continued to advance uphill and disappeared into the wood, where they now met stiff resistance. All over the steep terrain, more and more duels of infantry weapons flared up. Our attack grew into a fierce uphill fight. My squad dug in at the foot of the hill, ready for action, while Heinrich's gun was already up there on the slope. The American artillery fire was precise and brutal. The shells bursting around us tore up the white cover of snow, leaving behind large craters of brown dirt. Our comrades in the rifle companies further up in the wood bore the brunt. During pauses in the artillery firing, we listened, trying to discern their progress. In the late afternoon, it seemed our men were stuck near the hilltop. We wondered how long they could hold on up there under the continuous mortar and small arms fire from the American positions located on higher ground. It was a relief when, finally, our artillery sent some rounds over to the enemy's positions on the hilltop. Our Nebelwerfer joined in, their rounds whizzing overhead with a terrible hiss and rapid rate of fire. We were in a full-scale battle. The weather worsened. The temperature fell below 0. A light blizzard slowly enveloped the battle in a muffled and weird atmosphere. Then it was our turn. We were assigned to another rifle company and climbed diagonally up the wooded hill. As it turned out, our destination was the enemy's rear. Their present front line was unknown, but it was evident that the mass of them had withdrawn towards the hilltops. So we sneaked around the combat noise while the battle raged on. It was impossible to make out whether our original assault was being continued, or whether the Amis had started a counter-attack and our Jaeger were fighting it off. There was no doubt, however, that the enemy was determined to hold his ground. Only by great luck were we spared from becoming victims of our own manoeuvre, which was to encircle the American position on the hilltop. We were just around the hill, already stalking downward across a wide glade when we were barely missed by one of our own Nebelwerfer rounds. Sent down flat into the snow by the horrible noise of the rockets, we lay there scared to death for a few seconds when the rapid sequence of rockets detonated in the glade, no more than 30 meters from us. Eventually, under cover of darkness and unnoticed by the enemy, we reached the rear of the American force, a reinforced infantry battalion, as we learned later. My gun's position was on a steep forward slope, a clearing that fell down toward a trail at the bottom of a ravine leading up to a saddle between two hilltops, one of which we had passed. We emplaced our gun under a rocky outcropping and without delay started digging into the frozen ground. At dawn it stopped snowing and the temperature dropped further. For a short time there was a lull all over the battleground. Surveying the terrain, it became evident to me that our slope was dominating what must be a vital supply route line to the American battalion on the hill. I searched the ravine with my binoculars. Down to the left was a small bridge. Somewhere up along the trail, a detachment of our anti-tank gunners were said to be lying in ambush with Panzerfaustern, but I could not see them. We, it seemed, were an inconspicuous part of the snow cover spread over the hillside overnight. Suddenly, further up the saddle, we heard the engine of a vehicle coming down fast. A dark green tracked vehicle came into our sight as it was rumbling down from the upper end of the ravine. A big gun stuck out from a turret. Byng opened fire right away. The tracer bullets whizzed home, but they didn't do too much harm to the tank's armor. In a minute or two the thing would be right in front of us, but this wasn't to be. Some distance further up, fate caught up with it. Wham! A fireball. The tank stopped cold and jerked off the road. A Panzerfaust, fired from the whiteness, had knocked it out. The crew piled out, and our men, emerging from the snow, captured them, and that was that. We, up on the slope, were jubilant for a moment. Never before had we Indians seen a tank being destroyed. We also realized, however, how much we were exposed to more tanks once they managed to force their way up the ravine, and were not intercepted by our anti-tank gunners in time. It wasn't long before the Americans launched their first massive action to rescue their battalion on the hilltops. They started with an artillery barrage. It was the worst I ever endured. It lasted for at least an hour and a half. Shells rained upon us like hail in a thunderstorm. There must have been tens of thousands of shells scattered over our regiment's positions. How on earth could the Americans mass such artillery in such a small sector? On our slope, we were to some extent protected by the rocks above our position, but the fire was so dense that we thought it unlikely that we would come out of there alive. I don't know what was going on elsewhere. I only witnessed what happened within my sight. When the barrage ended, the Americans moved 2 anti-tank guns in. One of them appeared down at the bend of the trail, took up position, and started blasting away, apparently unharmed by our small arms fire farther down. Eventually, under the cover of gunfire, the first American infantryman came forward round the bend, leapfrogging between the trees along the trail. We opened fire on them at a fairly great distance, more or less at random, but they forged ahead until they came under our more precise fire and were stopped not far from the bridge. There they disappeared in a hollow, seeking shelter from the fire. After the shelling, a messenger arrived to learn about the situation. It seemed all our men on the slope had remained unhurt, certainly because we formed only a thin skirmish line, widely spread over the terrain, and because we knew how to take advantage of the cover available in a woodland like this. The messenger told us the casualties among the rifle companies were heavy, and Shaper had fallen, he said, up there at the hilltop, a direct hit, tearing him to pieces. It was only later that I felt the loss of an NCO to whom I had grown close. His good-natured features and his rolling gait as he trudged through our position at the Kiestinki front had been one of the human aspects which made me feel at home with our battalion. Down the ravine, the American guns kept firing, and more of their infantry came forward. If this assault didn't stop, our thin circle would break, and the ravine would be open for the rescue of the American battalion. Finally, some rounds of our Nebelwerfer came hissing and screaming right over our heads. The first clearly missed its target. The second and third must have totally knocked out the 2 guns and their crews. The attack collapsed soon thereafter, at least as far as we could see. The forward American squad remained invisible somewhere near the bridge, afraid to come out into the open, trapped in their shelter. We figured they had some wounded among them. Behind us, the battle raged on. The worst area was on the summit of the hill. where, according to a messenger, the now encircled American battalion was being pressed back into an ever smaller perimeter. It was obvious they were desperate to find an exit, supported by their howitzers somewhere outside, which did not stop firing round after round on our positions in a fierce attempt to crush the besiegers. Listening to the continuous bursting of shells up there, I thought of Heinrich being in the midst of it. We dared not imagine the casualties among our comrades. We never had experienced such massive shelling in the north. Sometime later on, the inferno burned out, and silence descended on this tormented piece of earth. It seemed, and we direly hoped, that we had held the ground around the hills. With the tension easing off, we began to feel our exhaustion. The total lack of food, of sleep, and of protection from the cold for the last 30 hours was written all over our faces. What brought back some life into our worn-out limbs during those lulls, aside from the hope that this matter would soon be over, were the cigarettes, which lasted far longer than our food.